Well, hello, hello. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning somewhere out there in the world. We are back, or shall I say, I am back on the Face of a Hero, still again on Thursday nights at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. I want to thank you all for joining me tonight. And I have two amazing heroes, the face of a hero. What does that look like, right? It's not just first responders. There are stories to be shared, testimonies to be uh, aired here on this show. And it's not my platform. The platform is for the heroes to tell us their story, to tell us what it's like to be in their shoes so that we can learn, so that you, the audience, from wherever you're watching me, from whatever country you're watching, you can take a nugget from it or share it with someone that may fit the scenario or the background or the story, because sometimes we don't always share the story. And in the part of healing and recovery, I think that sharing the story is a part of healing, and to be able to talk about it, to be able to share the experiences of what you've gone through, right, to help somebody else out. So I don't want to delay this. Without further ado, hang tight. We got some amazing, powerful testimonies today, and we're going to bring up two powerful gentlemen here. And good evening, welcome. How are you?
Good, good. Glad to
How are
be.
you?
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much for being here with me. I would say us, but my co-host is on MIA for right now. And so thank you for being here with me. And I know that you guys are busy. We have two heroes here on the Face of a Hero. That's Nick Cialdella, the program director of Never Alone Recovery, and Brian Bauner. He's in the business development department and the recovery coach. So that is so important to have in an organization, especially when it has to do with someone that is in need of your help and or services. So wow, I'm just blessed to have both of you here, get to know your story, and most of all to share on this platform what it's like to have been the before you to the now you, and all the wonderful things that you're both doing to help other people. And I commend you for your work, and thank you for saying yes to also the call that got you to where you are today. So, how are you, Nick and Brian?
Great.
Doing well. Doing well. How about yourself?
Wonderful. Well, I'm great. I'm just excited to bring back this show because it has been a minute. We've both been on MIA, and life happens, gets in the way, and then you get so busy serving in the community that you lose track of time. Here we are, March. Can you believe that? March 2024. We're almost a quarter of the year gone. Wow, time flies.
Tax season.
I can't, right, tax season. I can't say time flies when you're having fun, because not everybody has fun. And I think we should find some time in our life to enjoy life and have fun, right?
Mm.
So I'm going to get right into it, gentlemen. If you do not mind, I'm going to start with you, Nick. Tell us a little bit. Well, I won't say tell us a little bit about you. Tell us about you. If you can give us um, a summary of your story, and then go into detail after I bring back the summary with Brian, because we really need to know what has happened to you, where have you been to where where you are now. I believe that someone that's gonna be hearing your story is going to get something from it, and you may be saving a life in this show. You just never know. You saved one life. I think you did what you were supposed to. So Nick, if you can start first.
Okay. Well, thanks again for having us on. Um, quick summary. So, I mean, I will say this, that you know addiction is something that was so fluid in my family dynamics in my life, that by the time that I ended up realizing that I was an addict, well, I was pretty deep into it. I think that like we were talking a little bit before this, where I was kind of saying that it's like, the first time when I got loaded, first time when I used any substance, the next day it was normal. And I think there's a lot of discrepancy between what addiction really is versus like the choice thing, right? And I think it's one of those things that, like, the first time I got high, I nothing changed. It wasn't like,
Great for
oh,
you.
it wasn't like 13. So I was 12 or 13 years old, and middle school and sometime in middle school, and it was one of those things that like nothing about my life changed, right? And so that was like kind of what I was saying, was like the danger behind that was the fact that inevitably the seed of addiction was planted. I think it was always there. I'm a big believer in genetics plays the biggest precursor to whether or not someone develops an addiction of any type. And it runs in my family line. Like my mom is an addict. She got into recovery a year after me, right? So it was kind of like I spent majority of my life, my whole childhood, teen years, into my 20s until I got clean, where she wasn't in recovery. And because of me getting into recovery and a long story of things happening and me setting boundaries and having bottom lines with my mom, inevitably she made the decision to get into recovery. And for me, by the time I started getting high and really started getting high, it was like one of those things that like I was so unhappy with my life. I had a lot of trauma I went through. I had a lot of things I experienced between like being molested, and more than once, many occasions actually, multiple. And is one of those things that you bury it down, but to be honest, before that happened, I had already had a good ability to bury things down, having my mom be the way that she was, and the fact that she was not in recovery, and the people that she had in her life, and all the things that comes with the functioning alcoholic, right? And functioning ends as soon as the shift ends at work, right? Then it's no longer functioning. And so, which by definition is not, and so I grew up in a lot of ways where I seen what addiction looked like as a kid. And so anything other than either a, drinking and terrible relationships and putting your kids in dangerous situations and blacking out at restaurants and like all that, anything other than that, you're probably safe. And then her boyfriends were smoking crack, and my mom's taking us as kids. I remember being 5 years old. My mom's taking us through Inglewood, because I grew up in the south suburbs, but taking us through Inglewood looking for a certain crack house to find her boyfriend. And which is not a surprise. We're all white, and my mom's super white, and in that area, we looked out of place, to say the least. And even more so, I wasn't used to that. I wasn't used to driving through Inglewood looking through crack houses, but like by the time I was 5, I got used to it real quick. And I remember it was like getting high. It was just another experience in my story. It wasn't like profound. Like if I did that with my kids, like I have 2 children. Like I said, I've been in recovery since June 15th of 2015. My last using day was June 14th of 2015. If I brought either one of my kids through that, they would be so alarmed, because it would be so different than their life has been, fortunately enough, because they've never experienced anything. My son was 2 when I got clean, so his experience of me using was a window that he probably doesn't remember. And he's 11 now, and my daughter, I've been in recovery the whole time she's been alive, right? Thank God. And but they wouldn't be just another experience like it was for me. It would be a profound experience. But even though I grew up in Tinley, my household as a kid was the house where the cops were at the house. And in my neighborhood, there wasn't really cops at people's houses, but there was DV, domestic, so like one of these things that had such a profound amount of chaos around it. Anything other than that, it couldn't be. So when I got high and nothing changed, it was the most dangerous thing ever. And then you take what I learned in DARE, which was like, you're going to smoke weed, and then you're going to end up with a needle in your arm. You're going to smoke weed, and then you're going to be smoking crack 5 minutes later. And that's what they told us. So when I smoked weed and nothing changed, I went, everyone's lying to me. Right. And so eventually the day came where I was like, I'm going to do it again. I now had a reference point of everything I had been told was not true, or the things that I had witnessed was from adults, and I was still a teenager when I got high again. So life experience wouldn't make sense, but through the lens of someone that's 15, 16 years old, you can't see in that light that my mom was 40, 50 years old when these things were happening, So the next time when I got high, it was a little bit different. And by the time I was 16 years old, I had already been to my first treatment center, you know, and after my first treatment center at 16 years old, I got out of treatment and I started getting high again because nothing had really changed, you know, and my nothing had really changed in the sense that I was young and I still had this idea that anything other than what's going on, right? Anything other than smoking crack, 40 years old, smoking crack, don't raise your kids, or drinking and you're never going to show up for anything and you lie all the time. It's like anything other than that, it was like I was in the clear, right? So when I got out of rehab, I will never forget the guys in there that were shooting dope in rehab my first time. And in my head, I'm like, I'm in here for pills and mostly pills. And I was like, I can't identify. And it was a good reason for me to, once again, I found a new reference point for what I wasn't at that point. Right. And so it was kind of like, I got out, I continued to get high, went to school, and I barely graduated. But by the time I was 17, my father had already been going to family support groups. And because my parents were divorced my whole life, he had already been involved with family support groups at that point. So he learned about setting boundaries, setting bottom lines, right? And it was like by the time I was 17, I was given two choices. I could either go back to treatment or I could leave. And I left his household, and then I so by the time I was 17, I wasn't allowed to stay at my dad's house. Because I couldn't stop getting high and I wasn't willing to even think it was a problem at that point, and you had mentioned, I want to touch on something you mentioned before about the proactivity. The thing about addiction, the part that's really complicated is you won't know you have a problem until you are showing you have a problem. It's one of those things that like, it's proactive in the sense that, okay, there's a problem. Let's not wait till it gets super bad. But you can't be proactive in the sense of like, oh, well, let's prevent a problem. And with addiction, you have to at least exhibit some problem to then attack it. That's where like things that when I think of proactive, I think of things like my father, my experience, boundaries, family support groups, changing the family dynamics of everyone that's around them. So that way, in order to continue using, they have to be in a position where it is as uncomfortable. And the younger, the better, I think. I mean, I talk to families all the time when they're like, my kid's 50 and I'm struggling with boundaries. And I'm always like, I was 17. I knew what a bottom line was and a boundary was by the time I was 17 years old. And I think in many regards, because I was so young, because me and Brian do have a difference in our story. We have a lot of similarities, but one is, his experience where he was, and I'll let him speak about it, but my counterpart, which he can jump in right after I say this, was because I think I was so young that when those boundaries and bottom lines were implemented, it was far easier for me to gravitate towards a solution versus had I been further down the line, because my dad was proactive. It got way worse before I got clean and I was out of his house way before it got way worse. But I think because it happened so young, because everyone around me set boundaries, family, like my sisters, my brothers, like you name it, everyone had set a boundary with me. Some were physical, like my father and my stepmother. Some were emotional, like my siblings, right? It was like when all these people started changing the dynamics at such a young age, I think I sped up my process of using. Like I really went hard, which inevitably what ended up happening was was when I was 17, I got into a car accident. Okay, so it's an important part to my story. When I was 17, I got into a car accident that was horrible. It was a very traumatic experience. And I remember the experience of this car accident. It was actually my first felony, was a leaving the scene of an accident. And there was variables to the story that made it worse. Was like I had an off-duty cop who was not in his area in an unmarked car that happened to be under the influence of a little bit of alcohol, who was chasing me down a side street. So like, I'm not saying I didn't panic a little bit at first, but when you see a car going fast after that, you panic even more. And I ended up hitting a tree. But before I hit the tree, I'll never forget the experience of looking at the people in the car with me. And I could see they were yelling, but I couldn't hear. I went deaf. Like I literally could not hear anything, and I could tell they were
Mm.
screaming, but it was silence. It was the most silent I'd ever experienced because I didn't know what peace was at that point, and that was the closest to not peace, but when I think of peace, there's a relative silence. This was more of a traumatic silence than a peaceful experience. And
Mm.
that was the day after that car accident where my using went explosive up until the minute
Mm.
I got clean. Like I said, the last 2.5 years I was using, I'll never forget what I considered accomplishments at that point was when I didn't go to jail or rehab for 1 month. I remember that was like an accomplishment at that point because mind you, I hadn't done anything with my life at that point. Even though I
Mm.
was an adult at that point and I was in my early 20s, I had no reference point of accomplishment. So for me, not going to jail or rehab was such an amazing accomplishment. Now I look at that after being clean for almost 9 years. I have accomplished so much, but that's the sadness, right? Because addiction really, there's a level of just absolute sadness. I think a lot of people can see the symptoms, right? As a community, as a family, people see the symptoms: the lying, the manipulating, the stealing, the maybe committing petty crimes, maybe selling petty amounts of drugs or larger, depending on the individual. And they can see all those things, but it's all just absolute, this empty feeling, this what we call a God-sized hole inside of us, that at some point or another, I do remember the first time I took heroin, that was the day when my experience of peace was found, the closest to peace ever, which is sad to
Wow.
say now, but
Wow.
that was the first time where that God-sized hole didn't feel so big. And
Mm.
I mean, it still was just as big. It just didn't feel like it,
Right,
right?
right.
And I would say that using is one of those things that I used long past what I consider the expiration of fun times date, right? Like, because when you get high at first, it's so much fun. Anyone that says that, they never had good times getting high, that's an addict, that's not true. There was a lot of fun at the very beginning, really the first couple years. A lot of fun. Had a ton of fun. After the first couple years, depraved, degraded sadness
Mm.
and lots of it. Denial, a lot of lonely times of wishing I could be anyone other than me. Wishing and hoping that one day I would wake up and I wouldn't be Nick,
When you
you
had
know?
that accident, Nick, were you under the influence?
I wasn't, which is why I think it was so much more traumatic, is because of the fact that I was
You were
fully
alert?
conscious.
Right,
Oh
right.
yeah, yeah. So I was, and I've had some other experiences in my life on par with that, right? Clean, right? So it was like I've been clean long enough to have lived, and to live means two things really: joy, peace, sadness, fear. Like there's a lot of both when you live life. When I was getting high, it was just this sadness, fear. I always say getting high is like nothing changes but the faces. That was my experience, right? Like a
Mhm.
different set of circle of friends, or a different probation officer, or a different CO slamming the cell door shut. But everything was the same. It was Groundhog's Day, but terrible.
So
And
real
yeah.
quick, because I want to jump into Brian and then bring you back with other questions. When you said the slammer, when you were thrown in the slammer, obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously because I hear stories that even when you're in prison, there's still drugs. There's a lot of drugs in prison. Were you forced to be kept clean while you were in there? And if so, or if not, how long were you in when every time you were arrested?
Definitely not forced to be clean. In fact, the only time I didn't use or attempt to use was the last time I went to jail. Actually, it was the only time I ever stayed clean. But other than that, I'd been to jail. So I would do any. I would do like a bunch of 1 to 4 months. Like it just kept happening, right? So like I would do like 4 months for, so sad part, but right after my son was born, I had gotten another felony, and I went to jail, and I was in there for about 4.5 months, and after that time, I went into jail like I think 7 or 8 more times in the course of
Wow.
the next 2.5, 3 years,
Wow.
ranging from 1 to 3 months, over and over and over. Never like a weekend or like a week. It was
Right,
never
right.
less than 30 days. I never did like 2 to 5 years consecutively, but I never went less than 30 days. And I went like 8 or 9 times.
Wow. So saying that, knowing you have a baby now, that still didn't stop you. It was hard. Did you even try to stop?
I couldn't. When my son was born, I was so caught in what we call the grips of the disease, the grips of addiction, that
Mm,
I had no ability to see what was going on. Like so this is a sad part to my story. So my son, who I've had custody of my son for since he was 2.5 years old, and he's 11 now. So I've had sole custody of him. Well, I had custody, and then I got sole custody a couple years ago. But I've had custody of him, and he's lived with me. His mom's not been in his life pretty much his whole life, so he's lived with me for the last 8.5 years, pretty much, and uh, I don't. I was so high and so numb that I didn't feel it. And when my daughter was born, she's 3 now, and when she was born, the difference, it was like so beautiful. But then there was a part of me that was so sad because I remembered I didn't get the experience of when my
mm,
daughter was born, which this is the good part, like being there for her mother, right? And doing all the pieces and driving to this place and making sure everything's set and reading books and watching videos about like all of it. I really got engulfed in it. And then when she was born, the whole entire day, just driving my son to my dad's house, almost throwing up on the way to the hospital because I was so nervous. I was so nervous about doing it right.
right,
uh,
right.
and then when she was born, crying, sobbing, just sobbing, of joy, you
Hmm.
know. But there was a moment where I remembered later thinking about it, and I was like, I didn't have any of that with my son, and it made me sad for a moment. However, by that time, I had had custody of him for almost 6 years, so it was kind of like I at least had a good reference point of like, you know what, I wasn't there, but I've been there for him through all of his pain, all of his sadness dealing with his own mother, but also all the good things, all the experiences, watching him grow up from such a small age and spending the years clean and fully present. Baseball games, basketball games,
Wow.
baseball
Doing the
practice.
dad thing.
Right. You know what I mean? So I was like, I
Yeah.
at least had an ability to quickly shift into like, you know what, I missed that part, but I've not missed anything in these X amount of years. Right.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So we're going to pause right there, Nick. And I will say you did give us a disclaimer. You did say that if you happen to get off the air, just not off the screen completely, is because you may receive in your hotline a call,
That's
right?
actually one of those moments. I'm going to do that now. So you just want me to stay on the screen, but I'll just answer my phone?
It's up to you. If you like, just mute yourself, and then we'll jump into Brian. And so I'm thankful and grateful that Nick had chosen to change his life around, and that sees that it wasn't leaving anything good for him. Um, and you'll hear a little bit more of him, but now it's Brian Bauner's time. Thank you, Brian, for reaching out to me, and thank you for wanting to reach out to me um, and share your story. And so I think it's important for others to hear what you have to share. Addiction is addiction, whether it's alcohol addiction or drug addiction, it becomes a disease. And some people are in denial that they don't have that addiction. Um, Brian, who is Brian Bauner? Tell us about you.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me. So, who Brian is today is a grateful recovering addict, but who Brian was in the past, and a little bit similar to Nick, right? My first use of drugs was marijuana, and it was at the age of 12. Not very, there was not this big experience or this big moment that I can tell you about, and when I did it initially, I used to fit in or be like my other peers, right? And then, with the drugs or with the alcohol and the marijuana, not really a big deal for me. I really didn't like it. Really didn't impress me. But, a few years later, when I had dabbled in some of the harder drugs, being ecstasy, cocaine, and some opiate painkillers, you know, to give an example of how young I was when this happened. So I was 15 years old and I was working security at a local teen dance club, right? And a lot of the gentlemen that I worked with were older, and we were working the parking lot one night, and one introduced me to cocaine. And I was such a kid and so small in my mind and in my thinking. When I did this line of cocaine, soon as I was finished, I looked at him and I said, because it was December when this took place, I looked at him and I said, I can't wait till I get all my Christmas and birthday money. I'm going to spend it all on this stuff. In that moment, I knew I was an addict. And it shows how immature I was with a statement like that. Dibble dabbled, used pretty good for, the next few years. But I would say when I was introduced to heroin, that's when addiction fully took off for me. Kind of like Nick had shared, right? The first time I ever used heroin, initially I was upset because I thought I was using cocaine. But once the high set in, I looked at the buddy that introduced me to it and I said, my response to him was, life's going to be okay. For that first use, in that first moment, I felt like I had found the solution to all Brian's problems. And those problems, kind of like Nick talked about, that God-sized hole in my chest that I tried filling with money, women, shoes, clothes, all the outside stuff, I'll call it. Heroin was the first thing that Brian said, I can live life. I can get through life as long as I've got this. And, because for me, growing up was rough. I grew up with my father full-time, but my mother part-time on the weekends. My dad was a DEA agent, and he's the former lieutenant of the Lake County Drug Task Force. Wow. And my mother was a drug addict herself and ran with some very powerful organizations selling drugs. So, I had the strict cop side with my dad, and then I had the wild and rambunctious side with my mom and the people she was running with. So I grew up in Crown Point part-time, and then I grew up in Hammond the other time. And, being in Crown Point, I never felt like I fit in because my family was nothing like the other families. We didn't have the money that all the other families had. All my closest friends, their parents were very successful, and my dad was raising 4 children on his own. So, when it came to money or clothes or doing things like other families and kids did, I didn't have that experience. So I never felt like I fit in there, right? So then you take me, and technically I was the poor kid, right? The poor kids were the ones that I identified with more. And then you take me to Hammond, and right there, I grew up on the state line. So right there, Hammond, Cal City. I was typically the only kid that looked like me. And to that set of people in my life, I looked like the rich kid. So I didn't fit in there because I was the rich kid from Crown Point. In Crown Point, I didn't fit in. So I was always trying to figure out who Brian was and where he fit. And once I discovered drugs, specifically heroin, I no longer had that problem because it didn't matter. I didn't care. I felt like everything was going to be okay at that point. And I remember saying, I got to figure out how I can have enough of this to make it through the rest of my life. And when I had first started, I didn't know anything about addiction, so to speak, or physical withdrawals or dope sickness. I didn't know anything about that. I just knew here was the substance that made me feel okay for the first time in life. I didn't have to be scared. I didn't have to be fearful. I didn't have to worry about, oh, what are they thinking about me? Because what you thought about me was like my main concern. And then the physical withdrawals kicked in. I thought I was sick. And then the guy that introduced me told me, well, you're going through withdrawals. So then that started this long roller coaster of active addiction that I've been in. I had many attempts, right? Many failed attempts at getting clean, finding a recovery, living life like normal people do, right? Holding a job, going to work, taking care of my child, doing all these things. And I just couldn't do it. For Brian to stop using drugs for the last, we'll call it 25 years, it usually took a jail cell. It took handcuffs. It took a police car to stop me because I would go till the wheels fell off every time. Or if it didn't come to incarceration, it was cold out and I was like, all right, let's check in a rehab because it's cold out and I'm homeless. You know what I mean? So
what age was that when you became homeless? What age was that?
26. 26. And, that would continue on and off for decades, right? 52 arrests.
Wow.
And 16 trips to treatment. And, a lot of people talk about like how much time they've got in jail and stuff like that through addiction because, that's where it takes us. And like, I could say I've got over a year or years in treatment. That's how many times I've been to try and figure this thing out. And every time I would have told you it's going to be different this time. Never was different until Brian found some willingness to do something different, to ask for help and mean it and take some suggestions, because I always felt like Brian had all the answers, right? Like, kind of smart guy, I can figure this thing out, and it never worked. So now I'm so grateful to be at this point in my life. But through that journey, or all those journeys, we'll call it a bunch of journeys, right? I seen where the system failed. So that's why I do what I do today. Because, not that my way works for everybody, but I can give suggestions and tweaks that potentially could help people. And like you said earlier, if Brian just helps one, we've done something.
So when you say the system fails, can you tell us a little bit about that? Because being in there so many times, both of you, was there the help that you needed there? Did they even show that they cared? I have my co-host on the radio is a probation officer, and he tells me they're returning customers. They keep returning, they keep returning, they keep returning. But I always ask, have you found out the root of the problem? Do you sit down and speak with him? I don't know if he could, but as who I am in ministry, you want to find out the root of the problem. That's where you get to know how to help you. Did they offer any of that?
They tried, right? Yes, there was two people specifically that really cared about. One was a probation officer and one was a judge. And they did their best to give Brian some willingness to change his life, right? But I wasn't willing. So that's why I just said, like, I had to find the willingness. But for me, my experiences, and that's why I think we have such a different approach, because there's no one size fits all approach to recovery, right? Because Some of us different experiences in life, some different choice of drugs, whatever it may be. So I had to figure out what worked for Brian. I had to figure out how to approach and deal with and process all these things in my life to get where I'm at today. Whereas my approach might not work for somebody else, right? Like they say in a fellowship I belong to, they say what works for Brian might kill you. You know what I mean? So I can only give my experience
Right.
and the suggestions how I made it through specific or certain situations.
Wow. I mean, I can't say that I understand completely because I've not been an addict. I'm thankful. I could have made those choices, but I'm not in your shoes to know what really happened growing up in that environment. I The only thing I grew up with was seeing my brothers getting drunk, you know. Um, but having your parents, I mean, for you, Brian, having your dad in the position that he held, what did that do to you knowing that, well, wow, knowing your dad is that position that he's taking in Lake County? What the heck happened to you, Brian? I mean, I'm just speaking as a public would probably be thinking, right? How did
Right.
you end up like that, right?
So my dad, he quit when I was very young. So he wasn't in those positions through my addiction or any part of my addiction or using. But it definitely made it difficult because he had been at those places at one point in his life.
Mm,
So his outlook was very rigid. It wasn't compassionate, right? It was like most, just change, just stop. But there's so much more for me that goes with it. The trauma, the fear, the grief, the insecurity, the anger issues, all these things. And also my mother being an addict, right? His father being an alcoholic, her father being alcohol, like addiction runs
mm,
through my family.
mm,
So he was very closed-minded though, because he never struggled with addiction. My dad's 77 years old and I've seen him drunk twice in my life, so I didn't have that experience on that side. But my mom's side, I seen a lot. Very traumatic, very scary as a young child. I
mm.
never felt safe.
Wow.
And then, like I had mentioned before, my dad, he worked 2 and 3 jobs when I was growing up because he was supporting 4 of us on his own.
Right.
And my dad didn't have parents or siblings. I didn't have any aunts or uncles on that side that could help him raise us. So my dad had to do it all. So he wasn't present a lot. He did the best he could, right? Which I think is the case in a lot of families. He did the best he could with what he had. And a lot of times, me personalizing some of that, I felt like, well, you're always gone. You don't care. But my dad loved me to death. He coached all my baseball teams. But when you're trapped in those moments, I didn't see it as that, right?
Right.
You know, yeah, I had a lot of trauma and a lot of things that affected me, but it created this Brian that learned how to play the victim, right? And when I'm playing the victim, it's dangerous for Brian because then I can justify,
Mm,
well, look what happened to me. Look what happened to me. You would get high too if you experienced what I experienced.
right.
And then all those same traumas that I had experienced, right? I began to recreate those through my own addiction, which when we talk about the cycle of addiction, that's what it is. Me recreating those traumas that I'm trying to escape by getting high so I can keep getting high.
Mm,
And, now being where I'm at, I finally, like I mentioned, the willingness, right? But I had the ability to be honest because, like I talked about also, Brian never knew who Brian was.
right.
Brian wore a lot of masks. Brian was the tough guy. Brian was the athlete. Brian was the this. Brian was that. Brian was a guy that was terrified of life. That's who Brian was most of his life.
Mm.
I was scared of everything because I
Wow.
was unsure of me and who I was.
Right, right.
So I created all these masks based on who I thought you wanted me to be.
Mm. So when was the point or that hit you? When was your breaking point?
So a couple years ago, I was in a very, very traumatic car accident, where I spent significant amount of time in a coma and had a couple strokes and all these things, right? And somebody that was with me, I wasn't the driver, I was a passenger, but the person that I was with wound up passing away the day I got out of the hospital from some other issues.
Okay.
And that was the most broken I was in life, right? I felt like I didn't have anybody there for me. And there was this magical human being that appeared in my life, right? And helped me get to meetings, 12-step meetings, supported me, was there for me to cry to, was there for me to talk to, bought me groceries, fed me, because I couldn't work, I was pretty messed up. And when I got out of the hospital and through all of that, I continued to use drugs. And this person stood by my side and looked out for me. And then one day, she just finally had set some boundaries and I crossed them. And she said, "That's it. I'm done. I'm leaving you. I'm walking out of your life." And this human being stepped up to the plate when my life was the darkest. And now she's leaving too. And that was like that oh shit or epiphany or aha or spiritual awakening moment, whatever you want to call it, where I was like, something's got to be different.
Right.
And I decided that day that I wasn't going to use again and I was going to seek help. And I wasn't going to do it Brian's way anymore because Brian's way had got me 52 arrests and 16 trips to treatment. I was going to take some advice and some suggestions from some people that done it before me. And now I sit here today and life's really good.
Amen. Amen. And are you back now, Nick? Awesome. Thank you for what you're both doing. And right now here with the Face of a Hero, you're about to find out. You're probably saying, well, that doesn't sound like a hero to me. Well, actually, they are heroes because they're still standing here and able to tell you their story, able to say, I'm sober now, and this is what happened. So that's what we're going to find out now with Nick. When was your breaking point, Nick?
So I remember it clear as day. I remember June 14th, 2015, like it was March, what is the 5th? March 4th, 2024. I remember like it was yesterday. It doesn't matter how many years I've been clean. It's a profoundly broken time. And, I just gotten out of jail, which I should have went to prison, but, something greater had a plan because it wasn't my plan. And like I said, it was of all the times I went to jail, it was the only time I didn't use. And I remembered I got out of jail, and right before that, though, an attorney at the time, my attorney was in recovery, and I remember when I was sitting in the bullpen at Bridgeview Courthouse, he goes, "All right, we're going to tell them we're going to do a year. We're going to, that's like, we'll do a year." It was based on like I had been busted with some dope, and because I had probation, he was like, "We'll shoot for a year. Hopefully they take it." And I remember I had found acceptance. Like I had found a relative acceptance over this is it. I mean, I've played the game long enough, and I've done a bunch of different times in the county jail. Now it's time to go and do some real time. And I remember accepting it on the inside, like acceptance, truly accepting it.
Mhm.
And he leaves and he comes back 5 minutes later and he goes, he was pissed. I remember him being so mad because he was in recovery and he knew being in recovery, he took his lawyer hat off, I think, for a minute and was just like in recovery hat was on. And I remember him just being like, you're going home. And I was like, why are you upset? I was like, this is amazing news. He's like, they don't have the lab results, so therefore you'll be on a 90-day indictment period, but they're going to let you go. And I remember him being so mad, like just visibly. And I was like, what? And like, I didn't ask him because I was just like, yeah, I'm leaving, And, but later I realized why he was so upset was because he knew that I kept getting out after a month or 3 months or 2 months or 4. And I just kept coming in and I kept getting high, never stayed clean. And so he knew I was going to end up probably back in front of him again. That's what he thought, and it makes sense. But what ended up happening was I got released, probation was reinstated, and I get out, and I went to a retreat for a 12-step program I've been involved with to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the guy that was my sponsor at the time was like, Nick, you got 90 days to figure it out. And I remember as he said that, I said, don't need 90 days. I need this trip to end. In my head, I said all this.
Right.
I need the trip to end because I'm getting high as soon as I get home. Now, mind you, since I didn't say anything, that thought just stayed with me for the next 48 hours. I go home. Well, I didn't have a home. I went to the place I was staying at the time, and I remember I went to go score dope, and I got robbed on the west side, thank God. And so then, because I had to get high at this point, I was committed to the process. So I get robbed, sold a bunch of fake dope, but not like it is now where people get fentanyl when they say fake dope. It was just like nothing. There was no drugs in it. And so I go get robbed. I said, hey man, I think I got like a TCF account with like $20 in it, $30. Maybe I can overdraft it. Let's go score somewhere else. So we do that. I go and try to overdraft it. I remember I had just enough money to give the guy who drove me, because at this time my license was revoked. Like I had never had a license until I was like 26 years old, but my license was revoked at the time. And so I now owed this guy enough dope for 2 spots he had drove me to. So I had to double up on my normal amount, and I had barely gotten any dope. So I remember I score, I get high. I'm living, and I was staying in my mom's basement. We were at the point now where it was like everyone else in my family, nobody talked to me. Nobody had nothing to do with me. Everyone had boundaries that they had lived by with me that were set in stone. And I looked around the room, and I didn't have doors in this basement. So I was allowed to stay in my mom's basement, but the doors were taken off the hinges. So it was just in her basement, there's 2 doorways, and neither one of them had a door. And I remember looking, and I could see all the way to the wall. I could look all the way down to the other side of the basement. And I remember sitting there barely high, and I started thinking about my son, who was 2 at the time. And I remember feeling like such a worthless person. I'll PG it up, but a worthless person, because that's not what the language I was using in my head. But I felt like such a worthless person in that moment because I had been given grace. I should have been in jail in that moment, and instead I'm here getting robbed and still scoring and not putting any money towards my child. And I felt so absolutely worthless on the inside. And luckily, gratefully, thankfully, I had been robbed, so I didn't have any more dope. So it was like I was just barely high, and I was stuck with the shame and the guilt. I was stuck with the absolute feelings of total worthlessness, and I was stuck with the truth, which was that I had this child who I had done nothing to take care of, and I had picked drugs time and time and time again. And I knew the way I was going, I was in a moment where it was like I have what we call the moment of clarity, where it was like I'm either going to call somebody, get some help, and actually take the suggestions, of the treatment plan that they come up with, or I'm going to kill myself. Those are my options. I said, I'm not going to go and steal from my mom to go get more money. And I remembered I had that moment when I thought more about my son, and just when the shame and the guilt was great enough, I had almost like a turning point where I went, but it's a clear slate. He's so young that if I change now, I have a chance for him to never think I'm a worthless person. I really had this thought in my head was like, I have screwed over everybody that's ever gotten close to me. I have never had a successful relationship, whether it was as a son, as a father, as a friend, none of it. Hadn't done anything successfully. I said, but with him, I got a chance. And I said, I noticed in my head, I said, I'm either going to A, eventually die, and they're going to say your dad chose drugs over you. He was a junkie. Or I'm going to do something that I'd never done, which was be willing to take the plan that was set in place by other people. And I called somebody and I did, and I reached out to them, and everything they said to do, I did it. And I've stayed clean, ever since. Right. And it's evolved over time from the beginnings of, treatment and then early recovery and all those things to now where it is with years clean. But the breaking point to me, because I don't believe in rock bottom, I got to say this. So a lot of people talk about rock bottom. Rock bottom was created in the 1930s at a time when people that got clean, at that time, they didn't use the terminology clean. People got sober at that time, was people that were 50, 60, 70 years old. I mean, you got to understand that at that time, they used to put people that were addicts or alcoholics in asylums, right? And they were deemed as somebody that could never be better, treated like they were incapable of being better, locked away in mental asylums. And so the rock bottom came, which was an idea that, you're 50, 60, 70 years old. You've drank for the last 30 years. Your kids are 25, 30 years old. They want nothing to do with you. That's where that ideology comes from. Me, similar to my friend over here, the first time I did heroin, I had no idea I did heroin. No idea.
Right.
I was told, where I grew up in Tinley, at that time period, it was a big deal. Like now they do it with fentanyl, which is like way worse, but they're at least putting it in pills that are like sometimes, not always, sometimes they're putting it in. It's a poison drug market now. But back then that didn't really exist. So there was a period of time in Tinley Park where people were saying that MDMA, and it was bags of heroin. And I had never done MDMA. So like for me, I went weed, prescription pills, heroin. Like it was, and by the time I was 17, I had unknowingly taken heroin. And so for me, it was one of those things that when I finally got to that point, I said, you just got to stop. You got to be willing to take the suggestions of others. And Brian, and because this ties into a lot of what we do, Brian talked about the failure of the system. And I know he talked about some of the legality parts and the people that helped him. For me, a lot of why we've done this for all these years, why I got involved with this, was the failure on the treatment industry, the failure on how I was let down time and time again by the treatment industry. I went to rehab as somebody that was between the ages of 16 and 23. So I was under my dad's insurance and my mom's insurance. Even though my mom was an addict, she still always had a good career. And so I went to private places that my family spent thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars with insurance that weren't good. There's two parts to the story of why an addict doesn't get clean. Willingness is the one Brian hammered in, which I agree with 100%. The other part is, if you're like me, I always say this about one of the places that's a huge named rehab locally around us. You might see 3 of their billboards in a row on I-80. I said, the only nice thing I can say about that place is they had a koi pond out front, which was badass, because I've never seen a koi pond since or after. But that was it. That's not treatment. That's not recovery. My experience with private rehab was such a failure. I watched this documentary about this basketball player named Chris every single week, right? It did nothing for me. I didn't learn anything, but we watched it every week. That is a failure, is when you watch nonsense, right? And then there's treatment options out there that are based in practical action. There's a treatment model that's based in what's called the integrative treatment model. And crazy thing is, private rehab doesn't have to cost $5 to $10 grand with insurance, right? Like and just because you have insurance doesn't mean your family's rich. My family wasn't rich. They just had jobs that had insurance. My family definitely was not rich, And so my family was hammered with collections and all these things from a lot of the rehabs in our area for treatment that wasn't even good. It was the best place I went to in our area wasn't one of the private ones. It was actually a hospital-based, state-funded one. Weirdly enough, that's a problem, is that my family could spend 50 grand on treatment, and the one I go to that's free was better
that works
than the one. right?
Right.
Not that private rehab isn't good.
Right.
In
Right.
the in this, we built a system based on particulars, right? We found all of the best treatment centers that we could come across, as Brian talked about, for an individualized basis, right? Different people have different experiences. Certain places we work with are more catered towards professionals. A lot of people maybe have drinking problems or professionals. And then there's the ones that are more catered towards people that are 20 years old, similar to me, 20 years old, haven't done anything, doesn't know how to live life, but doesn't know how to have fun, even doesn't know how to do anything. That there's programs that are designed for younger people. There's the programs designed for people with more mental health, right? Maybe it's a bipolar type 1, whether it's trauma, PTSD, anxiety, depression, right? Like there's certain elements for different treatment. And when my experience was 10 years ago, when you went to treatment, you called the insurance company. They said, go to one of these 3 places that had
Right.
only thing they could tell you about was their contracted rate and how much they had to pay and how much you had to pay. But they didn't have any of the answers about like how many clinical staff are there, how many master level clinicians, how many beds, right? Like important due diligence questions. They don't
Right.
have that. They say, we pay this amount, you need to go here. That's a
Right.
problem. We wanted to be able to, like, if you called and you needed help for your son, who maybe does have one of the things I listed, boom, we'll run the insurance. We can make sure that it fits there. Same thing with, like, we work with people all the time that maybe have drinking problems, that have careers, though. Like, they won't feel like a big part of early recovery is like identification, and we do talk a lot about like similarities, not the differences. But right out the gate, if you got 6 people that are 19 years old that have never really held a job, and you send a teacher there with a drinking problem, she's going to feel kind of out of place. She might want to go to a place where there's other people that have lived careers. So that
Right.
way, right away, there's that
Right.
soft land.
Similar
Like,
background. Right. So
right.
I know that you're bringing up things from the Never Alone recovery. So we have a few minutes left. We're gonna get there. So Brian, you reached out to me. How did you end up meeting Nick?
So I met Nick um, at a 12-step fellowship that I attend. Um, I seen him at a meeting and heard him share, and through hearing him share, I wanted a piece of that because as he talked about, you know, I looked for the similarities, not the differences. Very similar story in a lot of ways. He's very well spoken, and I was attracted to that. He had this peace about him, and in my life, nothing was ever peaceful.
Mm.
So I sought it out. Like, how did you find this peace? I need some of that.
Hmm.
And now here we are. And
Wow.
and I've actually got some peace in my life. Look at that.
Amen. It's all a choice, right? So Nick, you found, or Brian was with you in the same place. He reached out and said, "Hey," like he just said, "I want some of that." What happened next?
Well, so Brian, what's weird, Brian? Which is funny though, because before you did get clean, we actually had an interaction over the phone because you had called, this is what, like 3 years ago or something like that.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I forgot about that.
he actually did call our 24-hour helpline at one point. I totally forgot. And
Wow.
weirdly enough, he got clean pretty much relatively right after that, or right around that time. But he did, and because I know his significant other, I've known her for a long time. It's a small world. Like when you really get involved in recovery,
Hmm.
right? Because and to me, like whether it's the way we do it, or you do it in another fellowship, or you do it in whatever way you do it, if you find yourself, because it's important to find a community. It's large, but when you get real broken down, the people that are really involved, like in our area, everyone knows everybody, so it's a smaller world that just happens to have a larger scope, and
Right.
an even larger scope is really needed because the amount of people that don't make it to that point where they actually get it,
Right.
especially nowadays with the fentanyl going around.
Oh
I mean,
my. Yeah, that's another show. They just found 11 point something million dollars worth of fentanyl in a car at the border,
Mm.
south of the border. And speaking of hotline, the hotline is here. It's been going across the screen the entire show. It is a 24 hours. And Nick, you're saying that you're manning it. You've been manning it pretty much on your own for how long have you had the Never Alone Recovery?
So Never Alone started in 2017. I've been doing the 24 hours, 7 days a week for about 6 years. And I took one break in 6 years. And that was after 5 years. I went to Mexico with my family, and that was around my 7 years clean. And that was amazing. But I also, as I talked about, like the particulars of why it's kind of designed right, I've up until this point, Brian has been learning to do the phones. He's learning to understand how to do it, and he's willing. He wants to do it, and he's good at helping people, you know. But I never took time off. I didn't believe in it. I mean, and there's a lot of sacrifice in that, you know. I mean, like I was just talking to Austin, our partner, and a lot of sacrifice, a lot of birthdays and Christmases and holidays and stuff. But that's part of the deal, you know, which is why a lot of people don't do the phone, not the way we do them. Because the way we do them is you're going to sacrifice time. It's inevitable, you know, because it's necessary. And we've over the years tried to have other people, and they wouldn't give up the time. And for us, this isn't just like a job. This is like, man, we're dealing with people's lives.
It's your mission. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
we're dealing with lives. We're dealing
right.
with people falling in a moment where they are panicking, especially if it's a family member. They're like if someone's high, they're maybe panicking a little bit, but like a mom calls, right? Like I was on the phone with a mom last night till about 12:30 in the morning. That mom's panicking about how do I help my daughter?
Wow.
And she called other places, and you know what she got? Voicemails, because it was too late, you know. And I talked to her again today. Didn't sound like anyone called her back. So I always tell people the same thing. If I'm awake, I'll answer, right? And even my kids know it. My daughter, she's 3. She doesn't quite understand. You know, and that's a whole nother conversation. But my son, it's all he's known. He knew me in recovery because you know, he's so young when I got clean. But he knows that. He's been to the events with us. He's been to the speaking things. He's traveled, you know. But he also just knows that I've been on the phones probably in the last 6 years, a year of it, like, you know, a year and a half of it time on the phones, you know.
And I'm glad that you are including your family in your growth with this type of organization, because they're seeing now their dad is the hero. Their dad is helping somebody else, and sooner or later they're gonna look up to you and saying, "I'm so proud of you that you stuck with it, Dad, and I understand why you were not around for this birthday or for that." You know, I'm sure that that's what they're going to be thinking when they're able to think for themselves and understand it completely. And Brian, did you say you have a child?
He is
Mm-hmm.
he's more of a grown man now. But yeah, he's 23 years old.
Okay, he's an adult, but he sees the difference.
Yes.
He sees the change from what dad was to where he is now. And you're both working this Never Alone Recovery. The website is neveralonerecovery.com. I have been the hotline has been flashing on the bottom of the screen. Neveralonerecovery.com. Brian is running the business development and also a recovery coach. They're here in case you need to get a hold of them. Actually, is there a number on your website or how they can get a hold of either one of you? Anyone that's listening, that's watching, that needs to go to school?
You go to the website, it has like a call now button on there. And either one of us, so he is, like I said, he's someone that also answers the phone. So the only options are me or Brian. You don't have any other options.
For now, but God's getting ready to grow you. I'll share that off the air.
All right. Share that.
Off the air. I'm just speaking it into existence because I'm part of Rahab's Daughters, and we have phone centers. And these are all made up of volunteers, but they have to go through the training in order for them to pick up that line. And it is a 24-hour live person every time they call, because there's different shifts of people from around the country taking these calls. We have one in Canada as well. So we're going to implement the same thing that we have with what you need with Never Alone. And that tells me something. That name, Never Alone, where did that name come from?
So Austin actually came up with the name, but I know the story. There's a meeting that was named Never Alone in this area, and that it all sparks. It all circles back around to 12 steps. We always are publicly anonymous with which specific one, but I will say that there's one that is named that, and that's where it started. He heard that and he went, "That's it." Like he's a genius, Austin. I love him. He's my best friend.
Well,
Partner, but
Austin,
he's
kudos to you too for
genius.
serving in this capacity to help someone else out. That everything happens for a reason, and it's not just that cliche. It actually does. That God allows you to go through things that at that moment you may not understand it. You may not like yourself while you're going through it, while you're feeling like there's no one there anymore. God has never left you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. And He's using you now as the same vessels, just a renewed vessel, right? To show others, to guide into a better life. And you are that guide. You are those heroes that you're helping someone else and being selfless and saying, hey, I've been there, done that. So I understand you. Most of the time people are like, well, you don't know my story. You don't understand me. You've never been high. See, I can't say I understand what it's like to be high on Skid Row. I don't know, because I just didn't choose that. I didn't have that environment. But it also sounded, from what I'm hearing both of you saying, it's like a generational curse. It has transferred from one generation to another generation. But I'm hoping and praying that both of you have actually broken those chains, and it's not going into another generation, based on what you both are doing right now with the Never Alone Recovery Organization. And so I want to thank both of you. I know we've gone over a little time, but that's okay. This is your platform. This is the time for you to share your story. For those that are in need, there's always somebody there to reach out. One last question to each of you. Brian, now where you are today, what would you say to little Brian?
It's okay to be yourself. That's what I would tell him. And also, don't be so hard on yourself, because nobody could hurt me the way I could hurt me. And I tortured myself, like I said earlier, trying to be the person who everybody else wanted me to be. And it's okay to be yourself. It's okay to be me.
Amen. And you, Nick, what would you say to little Nick?
Whew. Chills, got the chills. Man, I would probably say a few things, two things really in particular. One, it's not your fault. And that has to do a lot with a lot of the trauma I went through, especially being molested. There's a lot of guilt that weirdly comes around that type of stuff. It's not your fault. And the second thing is, you're going to go through a lot of pain, and you're going to continue to go through a lot of pain. But one day, you're going to be able to help a lot of people by just the fact that you went through pain, and you're going to help them navigate through that pain.
Awesome. Wonderful. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on this show, on the Face of a Hero show. I'm grateful that you have allowed your time to share your life story here on the Face of a Hero. And thank you for being the heroes that you are, that someone may be watching this show today and may share it with a loved one that's going through it, because they can't explain it. They don't know how to help them. This could possibly be what would be saving their life. So thank you. Yes, go ahead.
One more thing. Also, on our website, we do offer it's a support group on Wednesday nights. It's on Zoom. It's on the website. It's at 7 p.m. Central. It's unique. It's because we integrated my father, who's a board member and everything with our process. He's been involved with family support groups for 15 years. So we took our perspectives as being people in recovery, and we took my dad's perspective, and we created basically a meeting that I love working with the family. So it's a lot of family members in there. There is some people that struggle with addiction in there, but the majority of the people in that, and what that meeting is mostly there for, is for mothers, fathers, husbands, wives, to find a place where they can not be so alone, some empathy to deal with the fears, the insecurity, the scaredness, and also find some solutions. How do you set and implement healthy boundaries? How do you practice these things? How do you love someone in a way, because the way that we're wired to love, it doesn't work with someone using. So that's on our website. That's on Wednesdays. I just wanted to say that because that is
No,
such
thank
a
you. Thank you for bringing
part.
up, what services are you offering? It's all on your website, your 24-hour addiction hotline as well. How else do you help? You go out and speak. What else you guys do? What else do you
Oh,
guys
also, yeah, cool. Awesome. Thank you. So we created a system for, because I know I had mentioned some of the stuff with like the private sector, which we're a network of about 15 facilities that we've audited, but we also created the only one that exists of Medicaid direct placements in the state of Indiana. So when people call with Medicaid, they're getting treated just like the person with private insurance. Maybe they might go to a different facility, but they don't have to call 50 numbers off of some list that the other rehab gave you to call. We handle it all for people in Indiana, just like people with insurance. And step further, if they have no insurance, we have facilitated with other organizations, so we know how to help people get set up with presumptive eligibility. So we have created a system that's unique not only for the private rehab sector, but for the no insurance or people with Medicaid as well. We wanted to create a system where everyone gets treated like a human being. And we do that, I feel like, very well collectively.
Right. No, thank you. That's wonderful. Anything you else want to add to that, Brian? And we'll bring you guys back another time and see where we are.
No, I'm just grateful to be a part of this.
Well, thank you, both of you, for being here on this show, The Face of a Hero. Gentlemen, you have shared your story here with me, and now I get to know who you are as who you were meant to be, which is who you are today. And of course, every day is a never working process. It is a progress, and you've made both successful progress from what I'm hearing. Congratulations to both of you. Celebrate each day like it's your last day. And I know that God's got both of you because you are serving his people. So thank you once again for coming on the Face of a Hero show.
Thank you so much.
And
Thank you for having us.
I'll be back with both of you shortly. Thank you. All right. Wow. That was a lot. That was heartfelt. And I hope that this helped someone, whether it's a mom or dad that hasn't been able to reach out or reach through their son or their daughter or grandchild, or an auntie or a mom or a dad. I mean, addiction is heavy. Addiction is the percentage of addiction is higher now. We're not even talking about suicide. That happens a lot. I've lost a couple of people that I've known personally to drug addiction, and that is somewhat of suicide. But I'm grateful and blessed to have these both gentlemen come on this show. Please reach out if you are in need of help or someone you know you love. Have them reach out. There's always someone there, no matter where. There's several hotlines throughout this country. Reach out and touch someone, as that saying used to be, or still is. But until next time, I know we've gone over a little time. We'll be back next Thursday at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. So I want to thank you all for joining me on this beautiful show, The Face of a Hero show. If there is a hero out there, let us know. Peace.